This is BD World. I am SYED SHABAHAT and you are watching Fault Lines. The violence against Rohingya in the state of Burma is one of the worst examples of genocide in the world, and that too according to the estimates by a United Nations. Recently, United States has also declared the violence against Rohingya to be an act of genocide. But what has happened in Rohingya or with Rohingya in Myanmar or Burma? Well, the facts are quite worrying. There are 700,000 of them forced to go to Bangladesh. Their villages and houses have been burned down to ashes, and the land has been occupied by state institutions. Not only the government, but military has also used all means of violence against these people. And according to the official estimates, more than 600,000 of them have received this violence in one way or another. 6,000 of them were killed. The nationality was stripped off in 1982. They have to prove their nationality with documents that dates behind 1824. Our team has prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
August 2017 witnessed a deadly crackdown by Myanmar's army on Rohingya Muslims, rendering it a military offensive which the United Nations later described as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Described by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres as one of the most discriminated people in the world, the Rohingya Muslims are one of the many ethnic minorities in the country, with the majority living in Rakhine State. The government of Myanmar, a predominantly Buddhist country, denies the Rohingya citizenship and even excluded them from 2014 census, refusing to recognize them. The US has declared Myanmar's mass killing of Rohingya Muslim population to be genocide. Speaking at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., the Secretary of State Antony Blinken called the attacks against Rohingya widespread and systematic. The Foreign Ministry of the Myanmar firmly rejected the US announcement and charged that Blinken's declaration was politically motivated. Myanmar's government is already under multiple layers of US sanctions since a military coup ousted the democratically elected government in February 2021. A report published by UN investigators in August 2018 accused Myanmar's military of carrying out mass killings and rapes with genocidal intent. A case against Myanmar was also opened at the International Court of Justice in 2019, and it was lodged by Muslim-majority nation of the Gambia on behalf of dozens of other Muslim countries.
To join me from Washington, D.C., I have with me Ms. Emily Prey. She's a senior analyst at Newsline Institute, Washington, D.C. Emily, I welcome you to my program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Emily, what's the background of this issue of violence against Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar?
Faced persecution for decades in Burma, and there were clear early warning signs that a future genocide and other mass atrocities could take place prior to 2017. And these warning signs included restricting their freedom of movement, stripping Rohingya of their citizenship and referring to them as Bengali, restricting marriages, educational opportunities, access to voting, all sorts of things. And so I want to make it clear that the genocide in 2017 should not have been a surprise to anyone who was watching. And as for the perpetrators of the genocide, you need look no further than the state of Burma itself and the military junta currently in power. Many of the violent tactics that the junta have used over the last year to subdue and terrorize their population, they used on the Rohingya several years ago.
Are we sure that the state has played an imperative role in this act of genocide or mass-scale violence against Rohingya Muslims?
Although it was the military carrying out the genocide, it took place in 2017 while Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD-led government were in power. She even took the extraordinary step of representing Myanmar at the International Court of Justice in the Gambia versus Myanmar Rohingya genocide case. So it's clear that the military had her tacit approval in carrying out this atrocity crime.
Emily, it surprises us in this part of the world why it has taken such a long period of time for the United States to declare it an act of violence. I mean, 2017's issue have been recognized in 2022.
Well, the U.S. has a very strict interpretation of what constitutes genocide. So State Department lawyers go through a rigorous and complex process when they're deciding whether or not to call something a genocide. And because genocide is a legal term, under the 1948 Genocide Convention, signatories are legally obligated to prevent and to punish the crime of genocide at the moment that they know it is occurring or that they reasonably should have known that it was occurring. And so that's why you'll see states throwing around the legally non-binding term ethnic cleansing when in fact they should be using the term genocide.
And Emily, there are very serious allegations of sexual exploitation and sexual violence as well. What's your take on that?
Targeted differently based on their gender. So women are seen as mothers and bearers of future life who continue on the family line and thus the group as a whole. And so in genocide, when protected groups are being targeted with the intent to destroy them, women's sexual and reproductive organs are also targeted. And we saw this very intensely in Burma, where the sexual violence against Rohingya women and girls was beyond horrendous and inhuman. And the large majority of women and girl refugees who fled to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh are survivors of some form of sexual violence. And this type of violence can lead to both physical and mental trauma that can cause women to be unable or unwilling to procreate. And so this in turn is a way to destroy a group of people.
Thank you very much, Emily, for being guest in my program. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Emily Prey from Washington, D.C. And an important point that she has made is that for United States, declaring any act of violence as act of genocide takes a lot of legal homework, and perhaps this is the reason why it has taken that long. To join me in my program now from London, I am honored to have Mr. Mark Vermaner. He is director of a Burma Campaign, a non-governmental organization based in the United Kingdom. Vermaner, I welcome you to my program, and my first question is about, as you might have heard to my first guest in this program, the role of military in this entire episode of violence. How do you see that?
When the military were facing significant international pressure and sanctions, they started to bring in a new political system. It was a semi-democracy. They still kept control. They were independent of the civilian government, and they were still had their own independent budget, but the civilian government, which was later led by Aung San Suu Kyi, was allowed to control most of the government and lead the government, but the military still controlled all matters for security and defense.
But Suu Kyi not being in the government at the moment, and with the change that has taken place in the government, do you see anything happening favorably for Rohingya?
Leaders had in Myanmar, and those that had been forced to flee their homeland, that Aung San Suu Kyi, when she came to power, would pursue more positive policies towards the Rohingya. But unfortunately, it turned out that Aung San Suu Kyi shared the same prejudice against the Rohingya. She shared the same anti-Muslim prejudice as the Myanmar military. And so there was no significant change in policies. And the military used the prejudice there to justify an attack against the Rohingya in 2016. So there were some Rohingya militants, some armed organizations claiming to represent the Rohingya people. They carried out some attacks on some border police stations, and the military used this as a pretext for a large-scale military offensive targeting civilians. They did this deliberately targeting civilians and driving around 80,000 Rohingya into neighboring Bangladesh.
Mr. Vermaner, there are problems related to women. The sexual violence has been reported massively in this case. Do you have any insight of it?
We saw horrific human rights violations. We saw mothers were raped in front of their families, their husbands. We saw the drowning of babies, people being burned alive in their homes, babies being torn from their mother's arms and thrown into burning fires. instances of where the military, for example, were raping one Rohingya woman. Her baby was crying for breast milk, and the military slit the throat of the baby to stop it crying while they raped its mother. The human rights violations were absolutely horrific, and since then, United Nations investigators concluded it was genocide. And we have finally had now a determination from the US that what took place against the Rohingya was genocide as well.
But for Manor, if all of this, what you are reporting, is in the knowledge of the global community, then why has it taken such a long period of time for the United States to declare it an act of genocide?
Why it took them 5 years, only they can explain. This was a genocide which was predicted. You had members of the United Nations, human rights organizations, Rohingya themselves were all warning, we were warning as Burma Campaign UK, that the violence against the Rohingya is escalating. People were warning that there could be genocide under the bus for the sake of these business opportunities, and they looked the other way. And that gave the green light to the military that they believed they could get away with what they did to the Rohingya without facing consequences. And they were right, because apart from a few soldiers being banned from taking holidays in the European Union, there were no significant sanctions against the military for committing this genocide. There were no international legal initiatives that came from the US or others to try to hold the military to account for their crimes. Instead, what we have seen is Rohingya themselves working to try to bring about justice using universal jurisdiction case in Argentina. And there is a case that the Gambia, not the US, which is saying that it's leading on these issues, not the British government or European Union, but the Gambia, which brought a case of genocide to the International Court of Justice that the military are now fighting against. We have seen the International Criminal Court now launch an investigation into the crimes against humanity because the Rohingya were forced to flee into Bangladesh, which is a signatory of the Rome Statute to a member of the International Criminal Court.
What is the current situation at Myanmar at the moment? Because we aren't hearing from Myanmar any further about the Rohingya issue. Perhaps it has been over-dominated by other pressing matters in the media.
The situation for the Rohingya now is very precarious. The majority of Rohingya now don't even live in Myanmar. Since the coup, we have seen the military start to whip up more Buddhist nationalist feelings again, trying to use anti-Muslim prejudice again. And 500,600,000 Rohingya remaining in the country are in extreme danger. Now, there has been so much resistance to the military coup at the moment. The military are overwhelmed with trying to establish their control. They have not succeeded in establishing their control following the coup. But if they were able to consolidate their rule, then we fear that we could see a repeat where they try to drive Rohingya, the remaining Rohingya, out of the country. Those Rohingya who are still in the country are virtual prisoners. They are not allowed to travel. They are not given access to health or education services. They are in terrible poverty. The military-backed government is just constantly trying to find ways to make their life unbearable because it wants to force them out.
And how is the life of remaining Muslims in Myanmar? I mean, are they facing similar issues?
We've seen as well, not just for Rohingya Muslims, but other Muslims in the country, they are finding it harder to get documents like passports or other documents now. You even see where Muslims in Myanmar, they consider using different names that don't identify them as Muslim because of the prejudice that they can face, the difficulty in accessing documents and things like that. So it's a very dangerous situation for the Rohingya and for all Muslims in the country, because very clearly the Myanmar military, they see Myanmar as a country for Burman Buddhists, and they don't think that Muslims, especially Rohingya Muslims.
And Mark, for Manor, lastly, what has been the role of Bangladesh in this entire episode? of violence.
The Bangladesh has rightly received a lot of praise because it has hosted over 1 million Rohingya refugees, incredibly challenging for a country that is not wealthy. But at the same time, they have not treated the refugees well. The refugees are in a camp that is now surrounded by barbed wire. We saw one instance of a fire in the camp and people could not escape from the fire. The burnt bodies of parents with children who were burned alive because they could not escape these fires. We have seen the denial of education services to the children. Now, the majority of the refugees who fled to Bangladesh were children. This was a genocide mainly against children. And Bangladesh has not been allowing the provision of education services, which is denying a generation the opportunities for a more positive future.
Thank you very much, Mark Vermaner, Director of Burma Campaign, to join me in this program from London. Ladies and gentlemen, this was a heart-piercing story of the Muslims of Burma and the Rohingya Muslims in particular. We'll take a break and we'll join back with the second segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back. More than 3 million of Ukrainian refugees have entered successfully in the European Union from 31 different checkpoints. They are coming in primarily through Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania and Belarus. These European refugees, or the Ukrainian refugees in Europe, are entering with far more ease, which is unprecedented. This is the largest movement of refugees inside Europe ever since World War II has ended. This is quite remarkable in many ways. Just few years back, when Syrian refugees wanted to get into Europe, 1 million of them could enter within Europe in a period of 2 years. And this time it has just taken a matter of 3 weeks. The dual standards that European Union have showed toward these refugees are quite evident. Our team has prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my guest to this part of my program.
A new European refugee crisis has crystallized after implosion of Ukraine crisis, such that in a matter of 4 weeks, some 3.5 million Ukrainians have sought refuge in neighboring countries. Europe hasn't seen an exodus of this scale and speed since World War II. Equally unprecedented in the welcoming attitude that countries neighboring Ukraine have had toward these refugees. The European Union announced on March the 4th that Ukrainian citizens would be entitled to the newly enacted Temporary Protection Directive, that is, permitting them to live, work, and study in European Union member states for up to 3 years. Countries that have for years resisted taking in refugees from war-ravaged regions such as Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan are now opening their doors to Ukrainians. At least 1.3 million people, mostly from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, applied for asylum in Europe in 2015 during what was widely regarded as the worst refugee crisis since World War II, creating a backlash of political nativism in countries across the Europe. Nationalists across the Europe have made antipathy toward such migrants a centerpiece of their policy agendas, and far-right parties have expanded their power partially on an anti-immigration platform. As the continent contemplates how to handle this new humanitarian crisis, the different treatment towards Ukrainian refugees has also revived a moral debate.
The expert to join me in my studio is Mr. Saddam Hussain. He is a research economist from Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. Saddam, I welcome you to my program.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure to have you. We are talking about the refugees crisis in Europe in particular, but before we go to Europe, I believe the problem of refugees is a global phenomena. Tell us, how big is the crisis worldwide, and how important it is for the countries?
Refugee crisis, the migration and other things, these happen due to income, poverty and other things, but since 9/11 and after the induced extremism and terrorism, and then the wars and conflict in the Middle East and then Afghanistan, and then other racial, for example, extremism like in Myanmar. So these conflict and wars have made it into a global phenomenon, and it has a big scale. For example, there are 35 million children refugees, and almost 1.5 million have been just settled in past few years. 4.3 million people are stateless at the moment.
4.3 million are stateless today.
Yes, and 1 million children are born as refugees in last 2 years. So this is
1
a
million
big,
refugee
so
children.
This is a big number.
These are big
Yeah.
numbers.
But alarming thing is, or interesting things, I would say, 85% of these are hosted in developing countries, and only 15% are hosted by the developed countries. So the story is that wars have largely been created by the developed, but the hostage of refugees are primarily on the development countries. So there's a mismatch. Refugee crisis is more like in an ecosystem now. The wars and conflicts will go on. These can be minimized, but I don't think these can be eliminated, and these cannot be made into zero. So we have to live with the ecosystem. So there should be a long-term strategy that who is responsible and who should fund it, and who should be take collective responsibility for the refugees across the globe.
Saddam, as you very rightly pointed out, the problem is being triggered by the countries that are developed and that are more resourceful. It is affecting the countries that are less resourceful. But generally speaking, these refugees is a global problem, and it is affecting almost every continent of the world. So can you generally describe which countries are hosting most number of refugees, so that we can have a general idea of which parts of the world are more affected?
I was just looking at an article after your call, so I just did a bit of research, that 68% of refugees come from 5 countries. That's Syria, 6.8 million, Venezuela, 4.1 million, Afghanistan and South Sudan, almost more than 2 million, and Myanmar, 1.1 million. And 35% are hosted in Turkey. Turkey is at the top, 3.7 million. And in Colombia, Uganda, more than 1.5 million. And Pakistan is hosting 1.4 million Afghan refugees. If you know, like we are the neighbors, and the war in Afghanistan just made people flee to Pakistan, and we're still hosting 1.4 million refugees. And Germany in Europe, if you see in Europe, Germany is at the top. It is hosting 1.2 million refugees at the moment.
So this means Germany is clearly taking a lead when it comes to the hosting of refugees.
Yes.
Before these recent crises have in Europe. So going forward, European economy in general isn't doing good enough, and they have opened the floodgate of Ukrainian refugees. You just said Germany was hosting the maximum numbers, and now these are the bordering countries of Ukraine that are taking the lead. Countries like Poland, countries like Czech Republic are getting more affected. How do you see this to affect the European economies at large?
The European economy is already struggling. Inflation rate is at 5.8%, and this year in January, 13 million people were unemployed in European Union. They got unemployed because of the pandemic-induced bad economy and other things. Post 2015, 1.3 million refugees from the Middle East and Arab countries entered into European Union. But as you said, just in a few weeks, more than 3 million Ukrainian refugees entered into the European Union. But the experts from European Union say that would be less problematic, as Ukrainians can relate to the European Union. They have the same philosophy, same ethnicities also, and they are more educated, more skilled workers. So they will not be a burden on the European Union economy. But that's the long-term phenomena. There's a new research going on in economics that refugees entering into a country can bring more GDP, more productivity, and more demand even. When refugees enter into a country, they generate more demand, and more generate demand, more supply, so the productivity automatically increases. But that's a long-term phenomena. In the short run, you have to provide them with health and schooling and accommodation.
And that would have been my next question. Isn't it going to strain Germany's supply chains further? Because we are seeing a lot of economic problems happening just because of the supply chain issues in the world.
Exactly. The pandemic-induced supply chains are still there, and in inflationary effect in the world. And it is predicted that inflation will go up to 7%. 7% means that your purchasing power will be reduced. So that means that the government in Germany and European Union countries, they will be compelled to increase the wage rates, and when you increase the wage rates, there will be less fiscal space. So when there's a less fiscal space, obviously that strains the economy, and then the problem will start. Then there can be a nationalistic kind of protest that, you know, we don't need Ukrainians and they shouldn't be coming here, and these things, because it's a human nature. Obviously when there's a limited resource, you can limited resource, and there are two parties, so there will be a kind of a, I don't want to say fight, but there will be a conflict on resources. So it is quite possible that in a few months time, if inflation remains same and other things, that will be a problem for European Union. And according to the some estimates, resettling, accommodation, food, health and education for the refugees would cost around 30 billion in the first year, and European Union has just pledged 550 million US dollars. So you can see the gap between the.
You said 30 billion would be required just within
the first year.
During first year, and European Union has pledged
550 US dollar million.
500 million, so are 60 times away from the
exactly.
target.
So that's a clear problem.
And being an expert of economics, tell me about this inflation issue, which holistically looks to be more a global phenomena at the moment. We are seeing economies like United States and economies like China to be affected with inflation. But as you rightly pointed out, 5.8% inflation is there at the moment, and which according to some studies might rise to 7%. Now these refugees coming in from Ukraine, how it is going to change the inflation related matters within, or the inflation's effect within European Union?
Obviously the inflations will rise more, because when you know there are people, there's a demand for the products, so they will pay more, so the pressure on inflation will rise more, because inflation is like I am ready to pay more. So when refugees entered, but there is a problem that refugees are not ready to pay because they haven't anything, so the governments in European Union have accommodated them into the social schemes of the government. So Ukrainian refugees will be more facilitated to the social sector schemes, but that reduces the fiscal space. So there will be kind of ambiguous effect on inflation in coming months.
Saddam, the countries that are hosting these Ukrainian refugees mostly are Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania and Moldova. Now these are not primarily the countries that are economically doing fantastic. This is all the Eastern Bloc of Europe or underdeveloped part of the Europe, and with these refugees coming in, their economies might be more at risk versus economies like that of Italy, France, Germany, United Kingdom, more toward left and prosperous economies. So don't you think there is a disbalance as well when it comes to the issues of refugees?
Yeah, obviously there is a disbalance, but the thing is that in the times of conflict, you look towards the next country. For example, Afghanistan, they look towards the Pakistan and Iran. So you don't see that which country is best suited. You just flew and in the next country. But there's a matter of perspectives in the European Union, because they saw the Middle Eastern people as a threat to their economy, because they thought it's a burden on their economy. They would stay for long and they would be part of the economy. But Ukrainians, even they don't want to stay long in the European Union, and the European Union countries, they have a perception that they won't stay for long because there's a conflict and they're educated, they are skilled, and their country is relatively much better. Just the conflict now, there's a disbalance, but they would want to go back to Ukraine. Again, Middle Eastern countries was a burden because they were mostly unskilled labor, and there was language problem, and there was a different kind of education in Middle East and European Union. But European Union and Ukraine are more similar in education and skills, and most of them are skilled. So some economists also say that maybe European Union countries consider them as a good human resource, which could be utilized, because there's also a human resource problem in European Union. They have resources, but low on human resource. But time will tell. In the long run, as I say, they can be of great use, but in the short run, that will certainly create problems for the economy.
We have we have talked a lot about the economic side of it, but there is a social side of it as well, and that I would like to discuss with you. Very recently, I think it was back in January 2022, when Belarusia and Poland had this refugees crisis. So there were many on Belarusian border. They were not originally Belarusians, but people from Belarus were trying to enter. Most of them had come from Middle East. They wanted to enter European Union, and European Union had not only changed the constitution, changed the laws that deal with the influx of refugees, but also dealt them with some stiff resistance and with the use of coercive means. Few weeks pass by, here comes in white, blonde Ukrainians, and the gates are opened. Don't you think this in itself is also a demonstration that the human rights do not apply equally and are selected based on our colors, our creed, and our gender?
True, there's a problem, and many countries and many leaders have been exposed that the dual standards. There's separate rules for someone else and separate for someone else. But there's a problem of a perception. Being a realist, I would say that the media and the social media and the stereotyping done for the past few decades have resulted in this. Because if I'm a German, I don't see Ukrainian as a threat. I see him as my neighbor, educated neighbor, white neighbor. Maybe I know his ethnicity too, I know his language too. On a cultural level, on a values level, we are similar. But in the Middle East, because of all that stereotyping and media and social media, they consider them as a threat. Maybe there are extremists in them, maybe there's a terrorist in them, maybe there are spies in them, spies of the extremist groups and others. So maybe then they want to infiltrate us. What if there's a security problem? Who will be responsible? And then this is a burden on the law enforcement agencies. So that's a shortcut, to stop them. So
just to add into your point, and I'll listen to you further, Bulgarian Prime Minister Karel Patkov has given a remarkable statement. He says, these people are intelligent, they are educated. This is not the refugees wave we have been used to. People were not sure about their identity. People with unclear past who could have been even terrorists. True. So this is stereotyping of brown people being, or Muslims or people from Middle East being terrorists. Don't you think this is on quite some peak within Europe now?
There are many books have been written, the rise of nationalism. So I guess that we are transitioning towards the rise of nationalism. We are Europeans, we are Russians, and we are Muslims and Middle Easterns. So that has been subtle in the past few decades, but now it's very much obvious and explicit. So I guess it's kind of human nature, but media and social media have played a very negative role in this, especially the Western media. How they portray as the Middle Easterns and Muslims and Asians and the Westerners. So the leadership of Western countries, for example, in Canada, he is very vocal about this. He is against the racial segregation and racial profiling. So I guess Western leaders have to think of a way that.
But Saddam, these are alarming times because these statements have come from the head of the state.
Yeah, but at the same time, for example, at the stand Prime Minister Imran Khan took, and now there is a day allocated for declared as anti-Islamophobia day at the UN. So there is a feeling and acknowledgement that this is an issue. So I guess in the coming months, maybe more and more people acknowledge that this is an issue, and we have to deal with as a collectively as a global citizens. Otherwise, this will go out of hand.
Saddam, going forward, going back to the strategic angle of the conversation that we are just having. So there are problems within Russia as well. Russian economy is under the strain. And as we have discussed in our previous program, Russian economy is bleeding badly because of these sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. Don't you think many Russians will also be considering migrating to Europe? And if so, how would European Union facilitate, or how they might look towards? Would they look toward them as a hostile enemy in European Union, or would they also open up their arms like they did in case of most of the Ukrainians?
Yeah, that's true. Russians, especially those who are rich, they want to flee the country because of the uncertainty, and because they have money, they want to settle somewhere else peacefully. I think that the European countries would be happy to host them, because that would serve the purpose that against the Russian state. They would say, you see, their own people are fleeing their country, their own people are uncertain. So their own people don't like to stand by their state stance, and they're leaving the country. But at the same time, there will be a pressure that maybe there are some spies or some negative elements. So it's a catch-22. But if I were the European Prime Minister of any European Union country, I would accept them, because that serves my purpose. I can see that these Russians, even they don't even agree with Vladimir Putin, and they're leaving the country. But there's a pressure on law enforcement agencies to check the negative elements.
Thank you very much, Saddam, for being guest in my program today. Ladies and gentlemen, as my last guest in the program said, and I will repeat, most of these crises that force people to move out of their countries are originated due to the policies of the developed countries. The influx of migration is going primarily toward the developing countries, who are taking the worst brunt of it. As he said, Turkey is taking a lead in the entire world, hosting maximum number of refugees. Pakistan also, even in the past and even today, has hosted a large number of refugees and still sits on the top charts. This is now on the global community to think about the issues of refugees as a global phenomenon, and to address this issue more holistically. We'll join you tomorrow with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.